Yes, thank you very much for having me here today. So I'm trying to be terribly modern, and I'll be reading off my phone rather than traditional notes. So I'm not kind of sitting on WhatsApp or whatever while trying to speak. I'm genuinely reading from this. So yes, I'm Chris Cassells. I'm from the National Library of Scotland. And this afternoon I'm going to be talking about the ways in which institutions relate to community-based archives. So I'm conscious that as someone from an archive that's situated within a national library, we have a slightly different raison d'etre to most university archive services, but I think and I hope it's likely a difference of emphasis rather than anything more definite, and certainly in my career I've worked in local authority archives, university and business archives, and the question of community is really present in all of these spaces to one degree or to another. But in order to try and make this as relevant as possible to this conference, I'm not going to talk too much specifically about what the National Library is doing, but rather consider some of the questions around community archives and the communities themselves on one hand, and around archivists and their institutions on the other. So it's going to be kind of focused really on the literature and some of the theory, and of course there's plenty of literature around community-based archives out there. There's also lots of literature around the kind of different models for working with communities. But what I'd like to try and do is kind of step back a little bit from that and think about what we're trying to achieve when we do engage with communities, and consider some of the attendant moral and political questions. So these questions in the context of this presentation are not going to be terribly original, but for me it does feel like we are now in a place where assumptions about archivists as professionals and about our role in the curation of society's documentary heritage are regularly under question, sometimes for good reason, and I think it's worth regularly revisiting these questions of the kind of political, moral, historical role of the archivist, and continue to try and think this through. So the institutional context for this in the National Library is that we are halfway through a 5-year strategy titled Reaching People, where we are repositioning ourselves as an audience-led organisation with a focus on equality, diversity and inclusion, and on also on outstanding digital engagement. Now obviously everyone agrees we should be reaching people, and some of the changes have been really positive for the last couple of years, but it's also uncovered some really quite different understandings of what the purpose of a research library is, what the purpose of an archive service within that is, and how exactly we ought to be reaching people in their communities, and what the role of the archivist or curator should be, or even if it's really needed or desirable to have that role involved, beyond the kind of technical functions of cataloguing, providing access and so on. Before I go any further, I should obviously say this is a paper is really more of a series of questions than any answers, but I'm sure there'll be many people who've worked with community archives extensively and may, as a result, hopefully have some answers, at least inkling in that direction. And I've tried to keep this to 20 minutes, so I've maybe not covered as much as I'd like to, but hopefully I'll kind of get into some of the key questions around professionalism, the institution, and so on. So I've been thinking about community archives from very early on in my time at the library. I joined just under 2 years ago. It's partly because of the current strategy, but it's also because one of the first things I had to do when I started in this role was to deliver a bit of work as part of the first stages of a project that we are partners on, which is the Our Heritage, Our Stories strand of the Towards a National Collection project. So for those of you who don't know, this is quite a large UK-wide project with numerous partners that's looking at the linking and discoverability of community-generated digital content. So the task at hand at that particular moment was to basically provide a list of not just digital content, but any community archives we had in the collections. And this proved to be really quite difficult, not least because I'd only been in the door for about 2 weeks at this point, but even speaking to the people in my team, and it's not because we don't have material kind of relating to or reflecting communities and community groups, and it's not that this material isn't itself sometimes kind of originally community generated. It's more that these are records of communities held in a national library, in an archive, not community archives per se, and there's a sense that something changes when they come into an institution, particularly one where the perceived, if not necessarily real, always gulf in size between community and institution is so vast. So a quote from Derrida on the screen, cue collective groan. But the line is that the archivisation produces as much as it records the event, and it's, you know, that's seen quite often in the archive literature, but it's usually with the next bit left off, because it, you know, it's presumably unwanted association of our profession with the news media. But it's this line, I think, that sets the act of archivisation in its proper political and historical context, unsavoury as that might be. And thinking about this in relation to the records of communities that we hold in the library, it's difficult not to view the manner in which we, as an institution, traditionally took stuff in as being very much in the mode of what Derrida describes. You know, when thinking about what we could offer towards a national collection project, one of the first places I looked was our extensive collections of kind of club and society records as archives, which often document the social and cultural activities of very particular local communities. However, they don't look or feel like community archives. They reflect the preoccupations of a national collecting organisation that's structured very much along the lines of the British Civil Service, and that's that they consist mostly of minutes of meetings and financial records. And to be honest, we still collect records from community-based organisations, and we still privilege the records with informational and evidential value over what has traditionally been referred to as ephemera. And obviously this is something that's been the subject of discussion for many years, and 15 years ago in a paper by Andrew Flinn, he wrote about the crucial nature of all that material that we essentially dismiss as ephemera or ephemeral. And the term itself insists on a kind of absolute ontological distinction between something concrete and permanent, which is the record, and something kind of flimsy or vaporous or transient. And it's no wonder that even when there is a level of trust between a community archive group and the institution, there's still sometimes a level of ambivalence and hesitance in handing over custody of the archive itself. And the act of accessioning something to an institutional collection produces the archive as something other than community archive, and necessarily puts both barriers and distance between the community and the records. I think the second quote on the slides gets to the heart of this. On the one hand, as record-keeping professionals, as archivists, curators, whatever you want to call us, working within institutions, we have more than most the skills, experience, knowledge, and crucially the resources that allow us to ensure the integrity of an archival collection, access to that collection, the long-term contextual understanding around that collection, and so on. On the other hand, there's that subsumation amongst thousands and thousands of other linear footage of holdings. There's also the tokenism, which we should be frank about. I mean, there have been suggestions even within my organisation that we should rectify the current lack of community archives by simply going out and getting some. And obviously, we're not going to take that approach, and it's not difficult to explain why it isn't necessarily a good idea. But what's more difficult is to explain what we should be doing instead. And so I want to spend a bit of time, similar to the last speaker, kind of thinking about community and community archives before looking at the other aspect of this, or the other kind of side of the coin, which is the profession and the institution. And then I can finish with some general thoughts on potential ways forward, including a couple of examples of ongoing projects at the library. So I'm starting with two definitions of community and community archives, and the first is generally taken as the starting point for most discussion on this topic in the archival literature. And that's that a community is any group who comes together and presents themselves as such, and a community archive is the product of their attempts to document the history of their commonality. Now, obviously this is intended as such kind of short, simple definitions, so it's no criticism of the authors to say that it's really only the beginning of that definition. There are also international differences in emphasis. You know, this definition is kind of fairly standard on this side of the Atlantic, but as I understand in the US, the tendency is to use the term community archives in relation to archives which are political or activist in some way. You know, as has been noted, one of the few articles to directly address the issues that arise from community archives working with larger institutions, there are still issues with both definitions in terms of the exclusionary use of the term community, and the complexity of multiple identities for any community or individual. In a later co-authored article, Flinn addresses this, arguing that even in the most nostalgic and leisure-orientated community archive projects, there is something inherently political in individuals and communities taking an active role in the retelling of their own history, and that community archives exist in part as a response to the perception that official heritage bodies are not interested in their stories. I agree with this up to a point, but in the intervening period since the article, official heritage bodies really have started taking an interest, and not always in unproblematic ways. And so there are a few ways we can try to characterise community archives, which illustrates both the distance and closeness to the institutional archive. One is looking at the kinds of material community archives tend to collect. There are the created records and the accumulated records, i.e. those created as part of the organisation's, if there is one, activities, and the accumulated records are those amassed usually around a particular subject or area of interest. In this, there's no great difference between this and many institutional archives. However, community collections often include a much wider range of material than just what we would consider to be as professionals' archival records. So this can include museum objects, books, clothing, ephemera, in inverted commas. But of course, many of our archive collections contain these things too, although maybe to a more limited degree. I think where we as a profession get more nervous is the inclusion of copied material, which is sometimes found in community archives, copies of archive records held in other institutions, for example, or masses of photocopies and things like that. But again, I can think of a few collections in our stores that do resemble that. But the point I suppose I'm trying to get at is the question, or the difference is really a question of degree and emphasis. And again, kind of quoting Flinn, who argues that the self-selection of the term archive to describe many of these collections conveys a sense of the historical significance and treasured nature in which these materials are held by those responsible for the collection, which perhaps the terms library or even museum might not. And as Michelle Cassells points out, the archive is distinct from libraries and museums in that they contain both informational and evidential value. And this applies to the vast majority of community archives. In my view, we should respect them as archives, even with their differences, which is not always easy as an archivist, if you're confronted by a room full of photocopies. But community archives have another purpose. By their existence, they create a safe space for the community, somewhere where their identity as a community is recognised and taken seriously. So the activity of archiving in and by the community can be an effort in the construction of identity, but it is also, as previously mentioned, a subversive or potentially subversive political act, in that it undermines the public record and challenges the hegemony of the institutional archive and the role of the archivist. And I think this applies whether we're talking about a group of retired people with a common interest or an explicitly political community archive group. And of course, it's been pointed out, heritage and identity are not automatically good. They're not kind of good, unencumbered ideas or realities. They can be constructed in narrow ways which exclude, which seek to reflect some rather than all. For example, that kind of strand of English heritage, which celebrates an imagined Britishness and nostalgia for empire and all that sort of thing. And the last point to make is that many community archives are often driven by one or a small number of very enthusiastic and very committed individuals, and that helps these archives grow, but there's obviously that key problem of succession, and that might be where the institutions can come in. So what is our role as an institution in this? Again, Michelle Cassells identifies three different ways of seeing the impact of community archives. One is ontological, which is the experience of seeing oneself in history. Epistemological, the value of having proof of the community's existence. And social, the sense of inclusion by being part of a community archive project. But how do these values map on to our professional values, thinking things like provenance, original order, things like that? Where are they complementary? Where do they come into conflict? So I've got two slightly contradictory quotes on this slide. The first hints at something just mentioned, the potential role of the institution as that of a kind of preservation body when a community archive is no longer active. However, I think the second shows some of the problems with this and highlights the tension in the first quote between professional and non-professional. And this may be a necessary tension, but there's room to think of what we might do to kind of mitigate or navigate that. So Harrison Apple writes about how contemporary attention to the value of community records and community archives is frequently accompanied by a demand for such archives records and communities to confess precarity and to submit to institutional record-keeping practices. That is what Apple describes as an irresolvable friction between the archive's claim to empower through acquisition and the archival imperative to expand by any means necessary. I don't necessarily agree with that last bit, but I think that they are correct that we do have a tendency to reproduce the asymmetrical power dynamic of the documenters and the documented, because it is to a certain extent our professional survival that's at stake. It's that professional non-professional tension that's most challenging. Where this comes out is in collaborative projects. There can be a certain level of mistrust between community groups and institutions, sometimes well-founded, sometimes not. Even when communities do entrust their archives to institutions, traditionally, certainly within the library and other places where I've kind of worked, we would expect them to relinquish control. It's not necessarily a balanced relationship. So the collection comes in and that's their role finished, it's over to the professionals. The other thing to remember is that the whole motivation of community archive is to document the stuff that hasn't been documented by the institutional archives, and in a way that is accurate and under the control of the community itself. To give this up changes the nature of the archive completely. So the other question in terms of community archives coming into institutional archives is value. Where we traditionally take as our kind of metric research value, what do we do with that crucial ephemera? Can we, as Caswell suggests, respect this as part of kind of communities of records rather than persisting with notions of historical truth? But do we have the space in our stores to do that? And the last thing to say here, and there's a lot more that could be said, is that we as a profession have overseen the creation of collections that have aided what Caswell calls symbolic annihilation, that contain vast silences and misrepresentations of marginalised communities. And it's not just collection over a period of decades or even longer, it's the actual professional practice of appraisal, arrangement, description and access that have compounded that. So this is my final slide, and just to kind of think about some of the potential answers or ways to kind of mitigate some of the things that I've been talking about. I really like the quote on this slide. I'm still working out how it could apply to the relationship between institutional archives and community archives. But one solution kind of mentioned throughout this paper is to view the role of the institutional archive as coming in at the end of the community archive's life. Again, return to one of Flynn's papers. He notes that taking on a declining community archives means also taking on what may well be a new, different, and generationally or ideologically stratified population of donors, activists, with a distrust of such institutions, your institution, and intra and inter-community political divisions. As they say, the consequence of this is that we might need to rethink our professional skills and ethics across a whole range of different kind of archival practice. Another approach is the kind of the care in the community, post-custodial approach. Although that very phrase, care in the community, does appear kind of multiple places in the literature, it is problematic. It implies a kind of sickness or an invalid nature of community archives, a problem that needs to be resolved by archivists. I think approaching this in a more sensitive, flexible, and professionally kind of modest or humble manner has been shown to be more fruitful for everyone, although it can be very resource intensive and can be difficult to get support from the kind of parent institutions who might not necessarily see the value to them. I did quite like, there's a quote from an American archivist, Kenneth Klein. He kind of pointed out what seems like a very kind of simple, elegant solution in writing that it took us a while to come up with the idea that we really don't have to own the materials. It would be enough to borrow materials, scan them, and return them to the family of the organisation. Once we started that, we came across some really significant collections that the owners were willing to loan to us, which is quite an elegant solution. It's not always obviously practical. There are also participatory models we can employ. But again, these can be intensive. They require patience and long-term commitment from both parties. And in the context of archive backlogs, diminishing resources, pressure on staffing, this can be difficult to get institutional support for. However, the rewards are tangible. I'm conscious of running out of time, so I'll just quickly name-check a couple of projects we have at the National Library around Our Story Scotland and LGBT Youth Scotland, which are both ongoing projects around the LGBT community in Scotland, where we are very much working with partners to support the creation of material which will eventually, some of it at least, come into the library to be accessible there. And the Worker Stories project, which is looking at the experience of working class people during the COVID pandemic, and it's very much along a similar model. These are kind of national community projects, so we also feel quite confident engaging with them, and they us to a certain extent. But the problem, of course, the time that we expend on these projects is time that we can't expend on other community archives. So what basis should we use to decide who we work with? And I'll just finish by saying I think in general the answer, as is often the way, lies in being flexible and drawing on a suite of techniques, being willing to kind of privilege and rethink our professionalism while being conscious of the inherent power dynamic at play when the institutional archive is involved, and when indeed there's any interaction between professional and non-professional. And finally, I think we should, as Caswell and others have argued, bear in mind that records are able to liberate, make visible and act as agents for their users. If we begin to view records as agents, then we can begin to reimagine traditional conception of records and help uncover the potential for records to empower and perform in service of their users. Thank you very much.